Hi, I'm Christopher Warnock of Renaissance Astrology, and today I'm going to talk about how long do astrological talismans last? This is a pretty typical question. Clients ask me this all the time, students ask me, and really there's a lot of different answers that are possible to it. I mean, I don't think there's one valid answer, one right answer. I think there's lots of different ways of approaching it. I mean, I think the first thing that people use to answer this question is their own personal experience or other people's personal experience. Now, what I would say about that is I think that's very useful, but it's very limited. I mean, we're essentially basing it on only a few instances. We're also running up against a really major problem with all magical results, which is it's very, very difficult to know what caused what. Things can happen, and it may or may not be connected with a talisman or magically caused or whatever. It's extremely easy to fool yourself about it. There's that famous joke about the tiger medicine. This guy goes to visit his friend. His friend keeps ringing a bell, and he says, "Why are you ringing that bell?" And he says, "Oh, it's to keep away tigers." And the guy says, "But there are no tigers around here." And he says, "Ah, look at how well the magic is working." So this is again a problem with magic, and we're really dealing with a lot of times with subjective results. We're not necessarily dealing with material results. We're dealing with subjective results. So what I would say about it is that I don't have any doubt that magic exists in general, but I always have a certain amount of doubt about any individual situation. So like I said, what I would say about experience is it's useful, but it's limited. And to make a sort of broad, universal statement that such and such works for everybody for all circumstances based on a few of my own personal experiences, I think is problematic. I think what really happens is that we end up falling back on our models of what talismans are and how they work. And I would say this is the major determinant of what, when you ask somebody how long a talisman lasts, this is really what they're falling back on. They're looking at, okay, what do they think a talisman actually is and how they think it works? And then this itself is going to depend on worldview. And so at this point, I'm going to get people saying, but I just want to know the answer. So why do we have to go into all this philosophical stuff? Because the reason is because the answer you get from somebody is going to depend on the worldview and their specific view of how talismans work. Again, even if they have some personal experiences, they're going to interpret that based on their model of talismans and based on their worldview. So immediately this puts us into talking about atheistic materialism. So this is the predominant modern view of reality. For the most part, it's unconscious. People don't even think about it. It's just reality. Everybody knows it. And atheistic materialism is the view that nothing exists except matter and energy. And of course, E equals mc squared, so energy and matter are basically interchangeable. So that means that there's not only no God, but there's no spirits, there's no soul, there's no spiritual anything, no spiritual energy, no telekinesis, no telepathy, no spiritual forces, no powers, nothing. There's nothing but matter and energy. Okay, and so everything is basically can be explained by the material interactions of things. So like I said, thinking is just the brain, and it's just chemical reactions, and the chemicals break down to atom molecules and the atoms break down to subatomic particles, and it's all a random interaction except when there's specific physical laws. And so everything is random except when there's specific physical laws. And I think that's pretty much the bedrock of people's thinking. Now, what ends up being layered over on top of that is, for example, like I said, a belief in God or, New Age stuff. I mean, it's interesting. I run into a lot of people that seriously believe they're into astrology or whatever, but they think that the causality is magnetism or some kind of, electromagnetic force or scientific force. And they really, because of how could it be anything else? And nothing exists except matter and energy. But again, this isn't very well articulated. It's pretty much hidden. And then people, like I said, are very compartmentalized. So they're doing stuff that makes no sense in terms of the atheistic materialism, but that still is their bedrock view of reality. So um, this atheistic materialism for everybody, for myself included, is very influential. It's sort of like this sort of black hole of gravitational pull. We're all being kind of pulled into it. So, and a good, I don't want to dump too much. New Age has become very pejorative, but I think it does point to a way of thinking. And so, just interesting. I was looking at crystals, and like, what crystal healing was something that came up. I've been looking at lapidaries, which are books of the properties of stones. And so I was looking at crystal healing. So I found a really interesting quote. And this is like, why, how does crystal healing work? And it says, well, crystals are made up of different elements or compounds, which our bodies react in different ways. Crystals are minerals that hold energy, and humans are made of energy. We can exchange energy with the crystals. They work in hospital equipment and watches, so we can use crystals to balance our energy, the electromagnetic currents in our body. So that's the quote that I got. So essentially, it's 100% scientific view, is that crystals are, in fact, working through electromagnetic energy. We're made up of energy, therefore the crystals work with us. Now, the problem with that is there's zero scientific evidence of that. You could not, electromagnetic energy is definitely measurable. You can see the effects, you can see the fields, you can use instrumentation, everything, and there's zero evidence of that. If crystals healing works, it's basically spiritual or magical. It's not going to be working through electromagnetic energy. But that's something that people have a difficult time grasping because they're stuck with that worldview. So again, that sort of pull, though, of this energy or rays or beams model is very strong in astrology and astrological magic. And when we're talking about talismans, it also exerts this influence. So one of the key models for looking at talismans is thinking about it as a battery. So basically, it's a way of holding energy. You initially charge it with this energy, and then it will, the energy is radiated out of the talisman, and so it loses energy, and eventually it's going to be inert. So the logic of that is, if you see the talisman as a battery, then it's going to wear out. So, talismans cannot last forever because a battery doesn't last forever. So by analogy, a talisman can't last forever either. It's radiated all the energy out of it. It's done. So again, not unreasonable. And again, I'm not rejecting that model. I'm just saying, if that's the model you choose, then there's certain things that go along with it. And so you're going to say, okay, how long will it last? A certain length of time, and it's going to wear out. So if we go back to traditional views, again, the rays and beams, you can think of Al-Kindi. He wrote a book called On the Stellar Rays. He's a medieval Arabic astrologer. And so he had this view of everything putting out rays, not electromagnetic rays, but sort of spiritual rays. Not so much the battery view, but definitely kind of moving in that direction of the energy view. If you look at the traditional view of the way that talismans work, one of the key models that they used was the idea of natural magic. So material things are made up of the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth. So they have elemental qualities. So like hot and cold, something can have a warming effect, or it's cold or whatever. And then they also have what are called occult. Now, we tend to freak out about the word occult. It just means hidden. So occult properties from the stars and planets. They're not following their elemental nature, but they have these hidden qualities that come directly from the stars and planets. So the view was, and you can see this like in Albertus Magnus, who's a medieval natural philosopher. I think he's a saint, but anyhow, he's a doctor of the church, very, held in high esteem. His view was that if a talisman was made at the appropriate time, and you use particular materials that are appropriate to the purpose you want to place, and then you put the right symbols on it, as long as they're sort of not getting into anything scary or devilish or whatever, then it works automatically. That these are basically natural forces, and that it automatically works. It's just part of the natural view of things. Now, they're going further than atheistic materialism because they're taking in spiritual things. They're saying spiritual is primary, it's part of everything, and it'll have these spiritual qualities, but it happens automatically. You don't need to be dealing with any kind of spirits. And that's what really freaked them out. There's a very strong view that any kind of interaction with spirits was negative. The only way you could interact with positive spirits was through the church. The church basically monopolized it. If you were going outside the church, you're 100% dealing with demons. This view still affects people. It's, to me, incredible the level of fear that people have about any kind of spiritual beings. Now, again, my view would be that there's a wide range, that you have everything from the most evil to neutral to the most positive beings, angels. I only deal with positive spiritual beings, but I definitely think that they exist, and I don't think anyone has a monopoly on contacting them or working with them. So So that what that leads to then is this other view about talismans was that they work due to spirits, to angels or demons or however you want to conceptualize it. They're spirits that are giving the power. You're interacting with them, and that's what the power comes from. We can look. This is a very ancient view. We can look at the Corpus Hermeticum. It talks about animating statues. Um, Again, Thabit ibn Qurra, his De Imaginibus is a really ancient source on talismans. It's clear that those talismans are little statuettes, that you made them in the sort of shape of the person or that you want to affect, rather than a pendant or ring. We tend to think of talismans or pendants or rings. Originally, they were statuettes. So there's this process of ensouling them. And Picatrix, Book 1, Chapter 2, talks about making talismans through the actions of spirits on bodies. In other words, the physical talisman becomes the body, and the spirit becomes the soul of the talisman. So that's the sort of the other major way of thinking about how talismans work. So that's I'm kind of more in that direction, and but nevertheless, I was strongly influenced by Marsilio Ficino. He's a Renaissance writer, astrological magician, philosopher. He wrote a book called Three Books on Life. It's mostly about health through astrological magic. And he says, this is in book 3, chapter 13, he says that powders, liquids, and medicines, because they're in a liquid state or are relatively soft, he said, quickly and easily are impregnated with solar influences because they have, celestial influences. Because they're not very hard, they take on those influences very easily. He said, however, because they're so soft, because they're not hard, they lose that influence quickly. And so he says specifically of wood, he said it's not the best material for talismans because it's harder, so it's harder to get it to take on the influence in the first place, but then doesn't hold it very long. And he says ultimately gems and metals are the best because even though because they're so hard, it's hard to get them to take on the celestial influences. Once they have that celestial influence, they retain it longer. So I really, in my thinking, I had been influenced by Ficino talking about this, and I sort of felt that, and now there's some people that say, oh, it's pointless to make paper talismans. I don't think that's true. I haven't found that to be true. I think you can make anything as a talisman. And again, I'm not as captured by the materials that it's made out of. No, that's another thing that people are very focused on is it's like, oh, it has to be made out of a specific material or no point in doing it otherwise. I don't find that to be true. I think there's other ways of getting the influence or contacting the spirit. So, but in any case, I felt that paper talismans were more ephemeral than gemstone or metal talismans, and that's been kind of what I've been putting out there. So it's interesting though, my current model of how I think of talismans, and again, like I said, this is just my model, just my approach, is that I consider the talisman to be a portal or a means of communication, like a door, or really like a cell phone. If you've got the talisman, you have this very powerful mechanism for contacting and interacting with the angel or spirit of the talisman. And so, in my view, the power really comes from the celestial angel, the celestial spirit, and not from the talisman itself. In other words, the talisman, because is a means of communication and not the ultimate source of the power. Now, that doesn't rule out that they could be ensouled, right? You've got some of the spirit in there. It allows you to, as I said, as an entry point or a connection point. The other view is that, the celestial angels are inside of us and as well as being external to us. I mean, they're not, again, a more modern view would be that we create everything. It's all over our mind. Of course, the mind is material then. Again, that's not the traditional view and not the view I have. At the same time, I wouldn't want to say that these are entirely external powers either. They're also part of us. And so in a sense, we're connecting to something that's inside of us that we have already. We're just kind of bringing that connection into consciousness. Lots of different ways of approaching it. So I think that, again, even with my view, you can see it's not necessarily, I've got different sort of models floating around. They don't always, totally interact with each other logically. We're going to kind of use them. It's sort of like I've got a hammer and I pick up a hammer, put that down and pick up a screwdriver. They've got different jobs to do. They're good for different things. And it doesn't invalidate them that say that they're different and they don't all do the same thing. It's interesting. I've been researching lapidaries, which are books of the sort of properties of stones and gemstones. Just got a copy of this Speculum Lapidum, the Mirror of Stones by Camillo Leonardo, which is a Renaissance author. It's translated by Margherita Fiorello. I'm going to have a link on the YouTube page where you can take a look at this. I think this is a really interesting book. I enjoyed reading it. Um, and it's interesting because, we're living in a time where we have an incredible access to translations. This is sort of this incredible efflorescence. People are getting very excited about this, and we're getting all sorts of translations and stuff available. So this is just one of them. Um, so it's interesting. I said this is a lapidary. There's a long tradition of these. They give the powers of stones and minerals. So what I found interesting about the Mirror of Stones was a couple different points. One was talking, again, we're talking about, how do they work? This says the powers of stones are not inherent, but they come from the planets, constellations, and fixed stars. It says, quote, "It is obvious for the ancient astrologers and Ptolemy that the virtue of the stones progress from stars, planets, and constellations." This is in section 2, page 2. Um, and then the next is, it says, "Trust the words of Thabit," this is Thabit ibn Qurra, who says, "Images carved in stone," in other words, talismans, he talks about Michelangelo. So it's interesting, he's making this equation of this talismans and as statues with the incredible, beautiful, Renaissance art that's going on. So I think this is one of the reasons I love Renaissance astrology and Renaissance magic, is because it's part of this whole incredible cultural tradition. Um, Finally, then he says the celestial powers are instilled in talismans, says, quote, "according to the celestial houses, the planetary traditions, at the moment in which the image is engraved." So again, this is a very important point, and it comes up. We see this in other. Cornelius Agrippa says this. Thabit ibn Qurra says this. And it's one of those things that's extremely inconvenient for people, because people are always coming to me and says, "Well, can't I just consecrate it in an appropriate time?" It's like, no, it needs to be created. It needs to take on its final form at the appropriate elected time, and then be consecrated if you're following the idea that it has, the spirits need to inhabit it. If it's natural magic, then you just make it and it works automatically. Um, so this is, again, this is something we've always insisted on at Renaissance Astrology. All of our talismans, we have a very strict time frame that they have to be made in, with all the particular astrological conditions are in effect. And it's not simply enough to just make it whenever you want or buy it from some factory-made thing and then just, like I said, consecrate it at a particular time. That doesn't follow a traditional recipe. Now, again, you can do that. If that's your experience, you go ahead, but it's not in line with these traditional sources. So what it says, again, this is Mirror of Stone, says the philosophers engrave stones under celestial influences. It says, quote, "These stones acquire another virtue from heaven, as if the sculpture could acquire a soul." So again, this appears to be following into that ensoulment model, that the power, again, comes from the heavens, and that the spirits are directly involved with it, and they're ensouling the talisman. It's, in a sense, almost becoming a living being, and then it gains the powers from that. So then, specifically on this question of how long do talismans last, the Mirror of Stones cites Albertus Magnus, which we mentioned before. He wrote a book called De Mineralibus, or, on minerals, and it says, Albertus Magnus says that the power of talismans don't last forever, but Leondardi disagrees. He says, you know what? He says, if you choose a time for engraving the stone, by electional astrology, it says, the virtue of the star influences the stone and lasts as long as the image lasts. So here we're stepping away from, and I'm not sure exactly what Albertus Magnus, I could take a look at that in more detail. I need to look at De Mineralibus. But definitely we're talking about here the idea of form. And this is very interesting. Rather than a battery thing that's filled with energy, what this is saying is that by taking on the form, and particularly the image that's used or sigils or whatever, then that's the key thing that's happening. And as long as that form stays in place, then the talisman still has this, has the power, has the virtue, in other words. So it's interesting. The Centiloquium attributed to Ptolemy, Aphorism 9, says that earthly forms are controlled by celestial forms, and that this is used to make talismans. This is a very famous passage. It's quoted in Picatrix. Lots of different medieval and Renaissance, sources refer to that. And so, for example, if you think of the Scorpion pest control talisman, you would make this with Scorpio rising and to put Scorpion on the talisman, because everything with a Scorpion on it is connected, and in particular, the celestial Scorpion, Scorpio, controls or has a strong influence over material earthly scorpions. So we're not talking about energy or rays here. What I think ultimately we're talking about is this idea of unity and differentiation. That all scorpions, everything with a form of scorpion is connected, whether it's a living scorpion or whether it's a statue or a picture of a scorpion or Scorpio in heaven, is all connected. There's all a unity there. So if you, again, with sympathetic magic, if you have a picture of a scorpion, they have these talismans with a scorpion with all the body parts disarranged, that, essentially is a curse. And it, again, they call it sympathetic magic. It affects everything else with that same form. So again, if I think about this and sort of, again, my views are very much evolving. What I said 10 years ago, often have a different view now. But what I would say about it is that I think that, I can reconcile this idea of, like I said, quote, wearing out in a sense, because I think that the talisman, as long as it has the form and it's made at the right time, retains the potentiality to be a means of communication. It's sort of like it's a workable phone, right? But the question is, if the relationship is the source of the power, if you need to maintain that relationship and you don't communicate with the spirit, then that relationship's going to wane. So the easy thing to do with that is just pick it up again and make the call, reconsecrate that talisman. So again, you can just see how there's these different ways of working at it, and on the model and then the underlying worldview. For me, the spiritual is primary. There's no question to me that spiritual exists, that it is actually more important than material. And that perfection is impossible in the material world. I still to this day get people saying, well, why don't we use the real constellations other than material constellations, which being material are imperfect. They don't correspond exactly to the underlying spiritual idea that they reflect. They're in fact an imperfect reflection of that, and that we want to see through the material to underlying spiritual perfection and forces and ultimately forms and relationships, not energy. Energy is useful, but I think that the traditional view, as I said, much more, I think, in line with its forms. And that's how I see it. You've got essentially this unity and differentiation and unity and differentiation. And that is really the task of the mage, to figure out these underlying hidden and occult connections of all things and then to work with them. So again, I wouldn't want to say that my view was the only possible view. There's many possible answers depending on the models that you use. The key thing here is to recognize that everyone's working from a model. Anybody that thinks they came up with this on their own is fooling themselves. Everybody's working with a limited set of possibilities that are essentially given to us by the culture that we're in. And so and again, ultimately it's limited by worldview. Your models have to conform to your worldview, unless you're really in a confused state. Now, we do have a situation with atheistic materialism where people are positing sort of spiritual causality, and yet their underlying view is atheistic materialism, and that gets into a schizophrenic approach. But ultimately, you want to try to be as clear as you can about your worldview, understand your models, and then you can pick the model that resonates for you. My view is that there's lots of interpenetrating realities. Not every reality, every model is going to work equally well. Every model has its problems, its shortcomings. Some are better than others. But ultimately, there is no one correct view of things. But the key is, like I said, to be conscious of the models that you're working with, be conscious of your worldview, and then, like I said, find the worldview that resonates for you. So certainly, the beams and rays and batteries model is perfectly fine as a model. If that fits your experience, if that resonates for you, then that's the one you should use. And then that has certain consequences. That means you're going to have to recharge the talisman. Similarly, if you've got the form view, what I would say about it is that in my articulation of that the potential talisman, as long as it's not broken, as long as that image is still on the talisman, it still has the potential to connect. But you need to go ahead and step up and make that connection. And if you do it on a regular basis, you're going to keep that connection with the spirit strong and be able to get the best possible effects that you can from the talisman. So again, you can see how the different models have different results, and ultimately you want to find what resonates for you after your journey of self-discovery. So I hope you find that useful. Check out the Mirror of Stones, and I'll look forward to talking about these issues and also more up on lapidaries in future videos.